Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar of our monthly series where we aim to highlight rigorous research in the scientific study of international migration. We are super excited that you could join us today. My name is Jens Heimler. I'm one of the faculty co-directors of the Immigration Policy Lab, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before we get started, just as usual, quick housekeeping. So the session is being recorded, and a recording of the presentation will be available on the IPL website and the YouTube channel. We encourage all of you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. During the last 15 minutes, I will select a few questions for the presenter to answer. Due to the limit time we have together, we may not be able to answer all of the questions. At the end of the webinar, we'll send a link to a Google form from the Zoom chat where you can provide feedback and suggest speakers for future seminars. The link can also be found on the IPL website. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Zeke Hernandez. Zeke is the Max and Bernice Garczyk Family Presidential Professor at the Wharton School at Penn. His research focuses on global and corporate strategy with a focus on how the movement of talent, ideas, and firms create economic prosperities. He has a lot of great publications that I encourage you to check out on his website. Also a book about migration more broadly that I highly recommend people to read. And the title of his talk today is Icing the Economy, Immigration Enforcement in Local Businesses. So welcome to our Science of International Migration seminar. Zeke, the floor is yours. Very excited to have you.
Thanks so much, Jens. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate all of you that are here. Um, I don't take it for granted that you're spending an hour of your time during which you could be doing probably a lot of other things. Just a couple things by way of preamble before getting into the project I want to present. First of all, I really want to thank the Immigration Policy Lab for the work that they do. It's really important, and I think that now more than ever, having vehicles through which we can bring facts and accurate information about immigration is essential. And then also just want to express that I feel very honored to be among this lineup of speakers. Jens himself is someone whose work I've long admired, and so many of the speakers in this webinar series are people who inspired me all the way back in graduate school. So I'm just really honored to have a moment to present some of my work. All right, so let me jump into to this particular project. So one thing I want to say as I start is that this is the first time I'm actually presenting these results. So the disclaimer is, of course, these are not peer-reviewed or published yet, and they're likely to change as that happens. But also the opportunity for me here is to get a lot of feedback and comments. So I really welcome that. So please add comments and provide suggestions as they come up. All right, so let me start here with this image. This is a picture of an ICE raid in Chicago around the middle of last year. For the last year or so, we have all over the world, really not just in the United States, these images of a new immigration enforcement regime have been, I think, shocking, even to those who generally support the increase in enforcement. The way that ICE has gone about this in the United States is really unprecedented. Some of the things that are well documented, obviously, is that enforcement has moved from the border to the interior. The other thing is that the people arrested and targeted are overwhelmingly not people with any kind of criminal background. They're just ordinary people and workers who have no other record with law enforcement. And we have rightly so focused on the people involved, right? Those being targeted, but also those doing the targeting, the ICE agents themselves. And that is the most important thing that we should be focusing on. So what I'm going to talk about today is secondary compared to that, but I still think it's very important from another perspective. As someone who cares about the economy and business, as I see these kinds of images like the one in your screen, there's something else that really catches my attention, which is when this kind of immigration enforcement happens, not just how people are affected, but how is this business that you see there in the background, that hair salon, how is it affected? Or this other one here, you see a sign. This is a sign in Spanish advertising chicken breasts, a deal on chicken breasts. How are these stores and retailers affected not just in the short run, but in the aftermath. And we can think of effects not just in terms of shoppers and people showing up, but also the workers who are supposed to show up at these places. This is a really important question because it gets at not just the consequences of enforcement, but really more philosophically as to what should the role of immigration enforcement be. And that's the question I'm going to try to partially answer today. Now, I don't think this needs any more motivation than this because this is just important, okay? But there are some other academic, more theoretical reasons why this issue is worth studying. So, one of them is that there has been previous research on immigration enforcement, what I'm going to call targeted enforcement, which is what the way immigration enforcement has happened before Trump 2.0. Okay. And that kind of targeted enforcement was ICE showing up to arrest someone in particular. It's a very short-term operation that might last just a few hours, and ICE is in and out. Okay. And that kind of enforcement, there's research showing that it does indeed deter immigrants, not just undocumented immigrants, but immigrants in general from participating in the economy with things like not going out and getting health care, not participating in social safety net programs, children not showing up in schools, and certain immigrants not showing up for work. Okay. And then there is some work, but very little work, looking at how immigration enforcement affects non-immigrants, natives. But that work is in the service of that age-old question of, do immigrants take away jobs and lower the wages of native workers? The short answer is no. Actually, immigration enforcement, by removing undocumented workers, does not seem to have any impact, or there's some research most recently by Chloe East and colleagues showing that actually there is some negative employment effects on natives by the economy suffering. But that work is fairly narrow. The other thing is that there's no research on the broader economic impacts of immigration enforcement. I would say especially on the demand side, that is consumption and shopping. We know very, very little to nothing about that, at least from a kind of rigorous empirical standpoint. So the question I'm going to try to answer is addressing some of those issues. And it's what happens to local economic activity, both on the demand and the supply side, when you see a shift from the kind of old school or traditional targeted enforcement to this more general enforcement that, we're still trying to make sense of under Trump 2.0. Okay, so to get at that, I'm going to rely primarily on three sources of data. Um, and I'm going to try to here to not get so detailed as to run out of time, but to give you enough detail so you know what I did. Perhaps the hardest thing is having a reliable, systematic data set of where is ICE doing enforcement activity. Okay, this is actually not easy. It's much harder than it seems because while ICE does publish some fairly general statistics about arrests, that disclosure is somewhat selective. It's not complete. There's other sources like the Deportation Data Project that capture arrests. But for the kinds of question I'm trying to answer, arrests themselves are not the best source because many arrests happen, say, in a prison or in private, and they don't necessarily reverberate in the broader community. The community might not even know that this is happening. And so a good source to get at something that affects economic behavior is the media, because ultimately people's perceptions of what immigration enforcement officers are doing spreads through public media and social media or word of mouth. And so what I did is I took two enormous corpuses of news, CC News or Common Crawl News, it literally scrapes news every day from all over the world, and then LexisNexis is perhaps more well known. And from those two, I go through a process of starting with over 100 million articles, an enormous corpus, using some automated search terms to filter the articles that are immigration relevant. That gets me to about a million articles. And then using some pretty cool LLM techniques, some LLM scoring, I can systematically and much more quickly than a human identify two things. First is this article identifying a real immigration enforcement event? And if so, where is it? And other information that I'll talk about later. And so that gets me to about 5,400 unique events identified. And what's unique about this is that these events are geocoded at the subcity level. So I know the exact address or the exact point of interest next to which an enforcement event happened or the exact neighborhood. So what I'm identifying here not is did ICE show up in Los Angeles, but were ICE agents cited in a particular geocodable location. Okay, so 5,400 events. I'll show you some of that later. And then my two measures of economic activity are going to come from two databases. So Adven tracks foot traffic at points of interest. This is from cell phone tracking data that gets aggregated to specific points of interest. And a point of interest here would be a unique store or business like the ones in the photo that I showed you. I'm tracking well over 5 million unique points of interest for a period of about 110 weeks. And then spending at these points of interest comes from SafeGraph. SafeGraph tracks credit and debit card transactions. So I want to emphasize here that I am not able to track cash transactions. Okay, but sorry, let me go back here. But still, I have about 20% of the points of interest for which I have foot traffic. I also have credit or debit card spending data. All right, so a little bit on
So
the
Zeke,
data.
just quick question here from the chat. Like what constitutes an enforcement event according to your definition here?
Yeah, so an enforcement event is any news reporting in which any kind of enforcement agent showed up. Usually, it's an arrest. Okay, almost overwhelmingly, it's ICE showed up and arrested somebody, whether it's on the street, in a courthouse, or something at a workplace. But sometimes it's just reporting that ICE agents were seen in a particular location. Okay, so what I'm interested in tracking is that the community is aware that enforcement officers are there. But I would say 90% of the time it's some kind of arrest.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah. All right, very good. So what you can see is that, of course, there's always been enforcement activity, but you can see that the second inauguration of Donald Trump marks a massive spike and a sustained spike in interior enforcement activity. To give you a sense on the map, you can see where places spiked more than others. I want to point out that the spike is large. It's over a 600% increase compared to 2024. And you can see, of course, that some places are more targeted than others. Some of them, you can see that kind of makes what it would make sense, so to speak, based on places that have a lot of undocumented immigrants, like Los Angeles or New York. But Minneapolis, for example, has a relatively small fraction of undocumented immigrants, and yet it gets a lot of more enforcement. And then other places like Houston barely increase, even though they have many more undocumented immigrants than other places. So the enforcement is not purely driven by the number of potential arrestees, is the point here.
Zeke,
Okay.
one
And
one more question,
yes,
Gilal,
yes.
so from the chat. So the question is about whether the media coverage and the coding based on that likely skews towards more high profile raids and whether you might miss, more routine operations that don't necessarily make the news and what ramifications that might have for your analysis, or whether you could sort of supplement it with FOIA obtained enforcement records that capture these more routine operations.
Yeah, good question. So I have the deportation data project data, which is based on FOIA arrests. The correlation between these is actually very high. Um, so one of the reasons that I needed not just LexisNexis, which tends to cover more national news and wire services, is that CC News is capturing very, very local news. So something like, your local ABC affiliate, but also like really tiny local neighborhood newspapers that are reporting events. And some of them are very small. Like I have lots of events that are just one arrest. Now, it is true that the bias here is that I'm covering things that are newsworthy. Okay. So there is activity that's going on that is not newsworthy, and that is gonna create a bias. But again, my research question is about how individuals are reacting based on their perceptions of what ICE is doing, for which news is a pretty good proxy. I don't want to claim that it's perfect, but if I, for example, had a question about arrests, my source would not be the best, right? My question is more about how the community is perceiving what ICE is doing and how they react. So that would be my answer to that question. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for asking. Keep asking. One thing I want to point out here, this is so you can see a breakdown of ICE activity by city. Of course, the y-axis is bigger for some cities than others. But just one pattern I want to point out, and this is going to be important for the interpretation of the results, is that you see that one of the big changes in the way immigration enforcement started to be done is that when ICE targets a city, they call them operations, Operation Metro Surge, Operation, anyway, they have different names. And so those operations are the ones that receive more news coverage. But what you can see is that ICE is not doing one and done operations. When ICE targets a city, it tends to stay there and it stays there almost permanently. Yes, there's moments when ICE might have a surge, but ICE agents are always kind of roaming neighborhoods and roaming a metro area looking around, which is different than before where operations were kind of more one and done in and outs. Okay. Just keep that in mind for some of the results I'm going to present later. Okay, so data set construction. So I'm constructing a data set where I track every point of interest every week for 110 weeks, from January 2024 to the first week of February of this year. Okay, so remember that a point of interest is very specific. It's like Molly's Cafe here in the Philadelphia metro area where I live, and I observe Molly's Cafe every week for that time period. Okay. That means that this is an enormous data set, nearly 500 million rows. Running one regression on a high performance computing cluster takes hours. So this is not a project for the faint of heart. And then each point of interest is assigned to a metro area based on its CBSA from the census. Some very large CBSAs are broken into divisions, like New York has 2 or 3 divisions. But for the most part, you can think of metro area equivalent to a CBSA. And the key aspect of the research design is this. Every point of interest starts being coded as 0. They're not treated or not targeted, not exposed to potential ICE enforcement. Okay. Then starting with the inauguration, January 20, 2025, once a certain metro area has 3 raids within a period of 2 weeks, that's the kind of the on switch. That's the indicator that this area is now being targeted more systematically, and every point of interest in that area is at risk, so to speak. So the button turns on to 1, that it's treated. Okay. This is again consistent with how ICE is operating under Trump 2.0. The results are not very sensitive if I turn the treatment on or off, but this is kind of what seems to best fit the data. Okay. And so as it turns out, I get a perfectly round 100 metros that are eventually treated. I'm kind of not happy with that number because it almost seems cherry picked, but it is actually 100 metros that are targeted eventually, and 845 other metros that are not. And so what I'm trying to do is estimate an equation of this form, just to quickly go through the different components. The dependent variable y is going to be either the count of visitors in a point of interest on any given week, or the amount spent at that point of interest in that week. And because this data is fairly skewed, I use an inverse hyperbolic sign transformation. Other transformations don't really change the key results. I already explained how I measure treated. Okay, it's just this binary 0, 1 that turns on when the metro is like targeted by ICE, and that applies to every point of interest. And then I just want to emphasize the fixed effect structure. So I have a fixed effect for every point of interest. So Molly's Cafe in Philadelphia has a fixed effect that accounts for everything that's constant about Molly's Cafe, including its, obviously location, typical demographic profile of who visits Molly's Cafe, other characteristics of the area. And then I also have a fixed effect for every state by week, okay, which absorbs state level time varying shocks and trends and things like that. And then standard errors are clustered at the metro level. Now, if I
Zeke,
ran
one question here.
yeah,
So,
please.
from the chat as well, are you worried at all that there could be kind of like skewed reporting in the sense of areas with more business activity are more likely to end up in the news if there's a disruption compared to the places that have like less business activity, for example. So in a way, like the measurement of the treatment variable could be endogenous to the the business activity that you would see in the place, even in the
Yeah,
absence of the rate.
I am concerned about that, and that's where I'm going next. But yeah, yes, that is something that I am concerned about. I mean, having said that, ICE the decision-making process for what to target is not very connected to the local economy, as far as I understand. But it still could be that for other reasons, places that are targeted and that have a lot of immigrants also are places um, that are more newsworthy or could suffer more economically. So let me tell you what I tried to do about that. So the reason I would have a problem if I just did a regression on this equation with no other adjustments is that, as you can see here, the metro areas that are targeted are different from those that aren't. So you see here in the table on the left, some of the top 20 targeted metros, and here on the right is a kind of a random selection of non-targeted areas. And of course, what are different? Well, they're very different from each other. For example, they're much larger in terms of population. Interestingly, in terms of weekly visits, there is no significant difference. Spending is a little bit higher, but they do have a lot more Hispanics, a lot more immigrants. They tend to be more left-leaning, meaning they voted for Kamala Harris in the 24 election. And they do trend a little bit differently in terms of visits and spending. They're a little bit richer areas. So obviously, I'm going to have biased results if I just run a least squares regression on this. So what I'm going to try to do to deal with this, and I'll show you that I believe it maybe not perfectly solves the problem, but maybe mitigates the problem, is I'm going to use a typical solution in the immigration literature. I'm going to use a shift share instrument. No, I claim no novelty here. This is just a very typical use of a shift share instrument that is well established. This is going to be the instrument. So it's going to be the product of two things. So the shares are going to be the foreign-born population share in a metro area as of 2010, so 15 years before sort of Trump 2.0, predetermined. And by the way, if I use 1950 foreign-born share, the results are actually reasonably robust, not perfectly, but reasonably robust. Although 2010 is going to be sort of the main share I'm going to use. And then the shifts are going to be the total ICE activity across all metros, so national ICE activity in the focal week. Okay, and that I'm using national level because there could be reasons why a specific metro is targeted, but the logic is the following: is that places that have a higher baseline of immigrants are going to see a bigger increase in targeted enforcement, but that the timing um, at the national level is sort of separate from any kind of economic activity shift um, at the local level, right? That's kind of the logic of the instrument. Um, and hopefully it takes care of at least some of the more serious concerns. In terms of the first stage F statistic, the instrument behaves well, meaning that on the low end, the instrument sort of has an F stat of 30, which is sort of well above the usual threshold of 10, and it goes up to well over 100 in a lot of specifications. So that's what I'm doing to try to deal with those kinds of issues.
Zeke, one more question on the unit of
Yeah.
analysis. So from the chat, did you consider running the event study design more at the metro level directly, since that's where you code the treatment variable? Like what additional sort of leverage you get out of this point of interest within the metro area if you code the entire metro area as treated? And there might also be spillovers, right? Like
Yeah.
um, between if the particular street gets targeted, like it might affect the entire area around it.
Yeah, I considered that. And one of the reasons I prefer to do it the way I'm doing it is that I'm able to then look at heterogeneity within treated areas in some of the results I'm going to show you later. That's the main reason. But I could run it at the metro level.
I mean, it would
Um,
also make it computationally a lot easier.
yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You'll see in
It's
some of the
not
results I
me, it's
show.
people asking questions, so you should give
No,
them credit.
yeah. No, that's right. These are good questions. I think that at the same time, I'm losing a lot of variance, and there's going to be, um, I think, as you see some of the results I'm showing, you hopefully see some of the advantages of using heterogeneity within, even within treated points of interest. But I guess maybe if that's not apparent at the end, we can revisit that.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions about design before I move on?
They're probably going to keep coming, but at some point you just let me know, whether you just want to keep going or otherwise I'll just keep asking,
Okay.
whatever you prefer.
Okay, I'll let you know. Yeah, for now it's fine. Um, okay, in the latest literature on shift share instruments, as my best understanding of it is that it suggests that to assess the parallel trends assumption, what I should do is run a reduced form event study using really only the pre-trends because the post period doesn't really give you the treatment effect. And for the most part, the trends seem to be parallel, right? These are flat lines, right? The slope is never significant with the amount of data that I have, 500 million observations, sometimes a single blip, right, a single significant observation in the event study, can make the walled reach statistical significance. But I think the key thing is that mostly I'm getting very flat slopes that are not suggesting that after using the instrument, treated and untreated metros are trending differently. All right, let me leave it at that. I do want to take time to show you the results because there are several of them. Okay, so let's start with kind of the headline main effect. So the overall result is that uh, there's a significant decline in both foot traffic and spending. Okay, in percentage terms, so per store per week, foot traffic declines by 2.73%. And spending is a bigger number, but a more imprecise estimate because I have less data. But for spending, that's a drop of 6.18%. Let me translate that into something that's perhaps a little more a little more practical. Okay, so for foot traffic, for the average store in a given week, that's somewhere between 16 to 53 fewer visitors, depending on if I use the median or the mean number of visitors. Okay, again, that's per store per week, so that adds up over time. And for a lot of retailers, that is significant, and a lot of a lot of workplaces. The national kind of extrapolation is that this would be about 8 billion, 8.1 billion fewer visitors. Or if I compare that to the number of total visitors in 2024 before the treatment period, that's about a 3% drop in foot traffic at the national level. For spending, um, that would mean about 29 to 181 less in spending per week at a point of interest. Okay, again, it can add up over many weeks, and you'll see that the effects persist over time. Um, at the national level, if I use just the points of interest in the SafeGraph data, that's a 3.1 billion drop. If I were to extrapolate that to all the points of interest in the foot traffic data, that would be 14 billion. That's probably a bit of an overestimate, but let's say that the truth is somewhere between 3 and 10 to 12 billion. I think maybe a better indicator is just to say that relative to the year before, that's a almost 7% drop in spending. These numbers are big, they're meaningful. They show that this new regime of enforcement is really affecting local businesses negatively. At the same time, the numbers aren't so large as to be hard to believe, right? If I were reporting 80% drops in spending and foot traffic, I wouldn't believe that myself. So it's big enough to be concerning, but credible enough is my sense. And if I do a back of the envelope calculation based on the spending drop, that would mean that local jurisdictions are collecting anywhere from 250 million to about a billion less in sales taxes. So the ramifications of this decline in economic activity are reasonably meaningful. Okay, let me keep moving. I'm going to accelerate a little bit because there's a few other results I want to get to. So one of the things, and this is one of the reasons why I think doing the analysis at the point of interest level is useful, is that
So Zeke,
we
one
could,
question here on
yeah.
the estimates on the foot traffic and the spending. So do these declines kind of like match up? So is it basically people spend the same, but you just lose the average spending per person, or is there also something on the intensive margin?
Sorry, let me make sure I
Like,
understand. So the
like
question is,
people, spending less. Is it basically just like people spend the same, but fewer people are showing up,
oh,
or do the people actually spend less that show up?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's a good question. So it's both. There's fewer people showing up, right, which affects the spending, but also among those that show up, the spending goes down. What I'm showing you is the first one, right? Is that the effect that's driven by well, I'm actually showing you what I'm showing you here is actually the combination of the two, but it's driven by both. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, this is an important sanity check, right? So this is within places that are treated. Okay. So given that ICE shows up and targets your metro area, the effects are essentially decaying spatially. So in other words, the effects are stronger closer to the epicenter of where ICE agents are showing up, and they're weaker as you get geographically further away. That makes sense, right? People need to still live and eat and and get the things that they need to live. And so it would make sense that shopping and commercial behavior is shifting, in this case, toward kind of the peripheries of these metropolitan areas. Um, but what's interesting is that if you look at temporal decay, you do not see that the effect decays over time. Okay. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm saying here. Over the roughly year-long period or several months long period from when an area is targeted, and remember, ICE agents are kind of there permanently now, maybe not always in big numbers, but there's always someone there. It seems like that is leading these effects to be reasonably permanent within kind of a scale of a few months. Okay. In fact, what's interesting is that for foot traffic, the effect becomes stronger over time. I don't want to make too much of that. That's not the case for spending, but I think the safest conclusion is that these effects are not disappearing quickly, right? This is not just within a few days, everything goes back to normal. Um, and again, this is consistent with this new approach to enforcement that I showed you earlier. Okay, this is an issue that I think a lot of people are wondering about and is very important from a policy perspective, which is who, right? The chilling effect, who is most affected by this chilling effect? One school of thought could be that, look, if it's immigrants, right, undocumented immigrants, but perhaps immigrants in general who have most reason to be scared, and Hispanics, right? Because in the United States, the typical image or the typical profile of an undocumented immigrant is a Hispanic person. And especially given the Supreme Court's ruling that like actual racial profiling is okay, um, then one question is whether these effects are confined to foreign-borns or Hispanics, or whether the effects are more general. So two things here. For foot traffic, what you can see, these are the red confidence intervals here. Sorry, the red coefficient plots. You can see that indeed for foot traffic, the effects are stronger for shoppers or visitors, not just shoppers, because these could be workers too. Visitors that are foreign born, indeed. It's also stronger for visitors that are Hispanic. It's also stronger in stores that are in neighborhoods with high shares of foreign born and Hispanic individuals. But I want to emphasize that the effects are still significant for non-Hispanic, non-foreign born individuals and stores. And so the chilling effect is general, right? Even people who, I guess, rationally have no reason to fear because they're presumably not being targeted, they're also being affected. I think this is a difference between the old school targeted enforcement and perhaps this more general enforcement. The thing that's interesting with spending is that those differences don't show up. So with spending, kind of statistically speaking, everyone is equally negatively affected. Okay. So I think this is something that shows, um, I think, in my view, a sense of regime change, right? It's not just the same old enforcement dynamics. Okay. Now, another interesting cut is to
Seek one
say, well,
clarification question here. So on
yes,
the breakdown, are you breaking this down by the ethnicity of the store or the visitors?
yeah, both actually. So
Both.
when
Okay,
you
so it's
see,
in both data sets. You have both pieces of information.
I do, yeah. So this is again because we have sort of no privacy with our cell phones. What happens with this tracking data is that I'm able to know the home census block where someone lives, and I also know the census block, of course, where the store is located. And so the way I'm measuring foreign-born and Hispanic here is if the person or the store is in a location in a census block that has above median Hispanics or above median foreign-born individuals, relative to the metro area. So this is relative to the metro area. The results are very similar if I do this relative to, say, a national average. Yeah.
Thank you. One more
Yep.
question here, and it's okay if we eat into the 15 minutes at the end. It's totally
Yeah,
fine.
I
I
think we're
think
already
we
doing that, so
Yeah,
let's just keep
exactly. So
going.
don't worry about that. But I think it's good to get some questions in. And so there's a question about this chilling effect that you show, and it's interesting that it doesn't seem to decay over time. So at what point does a sustained enforcement climate stop being a shock and start functioning more like a permanent feature of the local economy? So do you expect there to be some form of adaptation or market adjustment,
Yeah.
or would you expect there to be some continued decline?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So empirically, I don't know the answer because not enough time has gone by, right? And I think that um, uh, I'm speculating now, right? But communities, I'm speculating, but based on a lot of like on the ground field work on this, communities are still kind of not sure what's going on. One possibility is that Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis, which is the one that received by far the most media coverage because of the killings of two non-immigrants, that marked a discontinuity, and that the new DHS secretary, and even he has kind of signaled that, look, we have to get back to like cooperating with local law enforcement and not doing this crazy stuff. And so if that's the case, you could expect that we're going to go back to the way things were before. But there's also a lot of a sense that while Stephen Miller is in charge, ICE will always have a presence in certain cities, and so then yeah, there might be some new equilibrium that's reached. Now, what does that mean for behavior? Does that mean that people are gonna, I don't know, shop at different hours, shift to online shopping? I don't know. I think that my study doesn't cover enough time to get at some new equilibrium. So I would say this is a short-term equilibrium, perhaps, that I'm capturing.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me move on to another interesting cut, which is looking at, well, which kinds of businesses and points of interest are most affected. Okay, so for foot traffic, one of the things I can do is I can distinguish between foot traffic at points of interest that are consumer oriented, think of retailers, versus points of interest that are worker oriented. So, for example, at a construction site, there is no spending, there's nothing for sale, but I can still see if people are showing up to a construction site or a manufacturing warehouse. Okay. And so what you see is that generally speaking, for foot traffic, the decline in foot traffic is significant for most points of interest. I don't want to make too much of the magnitude differences, but the magnitude differences more or less make sense, right? You can see that things that are a little more discretionary, like staying in a hotel or going to the gym or buying a new car, experience a bigger decline than things like getting groceries or gas, although the decline is still significant for those. Interestingly, all workplace points of interest see a decline. And then for spending, and here I want to say, for spending, that only makes sense in non-workplaces, right? And I also have less spending data, so I'm limiting this analysis to points of interest for which I have at least 20,000 observations. But also you see kind of that the spending patterns more or less make sense, right? People are still getting gas, uh, right, and maintaining their car, but they might be spending less at restaurants and fast food joints. Okay, so again, I'm not going to die on the hill on whether like one particular pairwise difference is really, bigger than the other, but the trend makes sense. Okay. And then the other thing that I can do with foot traffic is I can see if overall the effect is stronger for workers not showing up versus consumers not showing up. And interestingly, the effect is stronger for workers not showing up to work, and the difference is significant. Why does that matter? I think it matters because it's saying that, look, this is not just shoppers who are holding back. Part of the reason that we might be seeing a spending effect is that people either cannot or will not show up to work, so they have less income to spend. So the shock also comes from that side, which is, I think, why it's important to look at sort of the supply side and the demand side together. Another interesting pattern here. Um, One thing I know is I know if a store is an independent store or if it's affiliated with a chain. So to use my earlier example of Molly's Coffee Shop in Philadelphia, which is, an independent store compared to Starbucks, which is part of a chain, Molly's Coffee Shop bears the brunt. That is, it sees a bigger decline in foot traffic and spending, although Starbucks also sees a meaningful and significant decline. Part of what we're seeing here is that this new immigration enforcement regime is hurting the businesses who are the most vulnerable, small and medium businesses who tend to be independently affiliated. I believe also, from my understanding of ICE tactics, that this has to do with their strategy, in that it's much more politically sensitive to, say, show up at Target, right, and stop all commerce there, than to show up at a corner grocery store. So that might also have to do with how ICE chooses to operate. Okay, and then this is the final kind of big scale quantitative result I want to show, and then I have some qualitative evidence that I think you'll find interesting. One of the things you would imagine is that if people are scared, but they one of the ways in which one of the ways in which they could adjust is to switch to online spending at these points of interest. There is no evidence of that. Okay, so I have data on online spending from SafeGraph, and I don't find a significant decline or a change in online spending relative to in-person spending, which is, physical credit and debit card swipes or phone taps. The other thing that's interesting is that while I don't have the amount spent, one of the things that these databases track is whether visitors at these points of interest use delivery platforms. So are you getting your food from DoorDash or Instacart or Grubhub? And what's interesting is that we see that, again, and this is among people who also do physical shopping, so this has some limitations. It's not capturing someone who does only, say, online shopping. But among those individuals, we see a decline in the use of platforms, delivery platforms. And so this again goes back to what I showed earlier. This wouldn't make sense if people's income is constant, but if people are missing out on work and earning less, then you should see a general decline in spending and commercial activity, even online, which seems to be what the data bears out here. All right. So with that, let me just pivot to the last section. And if you have questions, just keep them coming. So far I've focused on large sample quantitative evidence, but I think it's important to realize that there are real people and real businesses and real human faces to this. One of the things I was able to do when I extracted all the news articles identifying enforcement events is I also extracted text having to do with chilling effect language, right? That is, when an enforcement event is reported, what else is said and who is interviewed and what are they saying about how they feel and what they're thinking and what is happening. And so, this is one example of a local paper from Spokane, Washington, talking about families and businesses suffering, 6 months after an ice raid, right? So kind of congruent with the lack of temporal decay, at least within the scale that I can capture. So I was able to identify over 43,000 articles that contain chilling effect language. Overwhelmingly, those are from 2025. They're from the new regime. Very few of those are from 2024. And I want to point out that this is a disproportionate small number, even given that 2024 events are much fewer. So I used some LLM coding to identify 6 kinds of chilling events, and you see the numbers in parentheses are the number of articles that mention that. So almost all of them mention fear and hiding. Many of them mention children not showing up to school. Reduced commerce is quite common in about a quarter of the articles. workers not showing up, foot traffic in general, so just kind of less people out and about, and then businesses closing either permanently or temporarily. Okay, so there's a lot of this, and this is the part that I think is really important to show. Here you see kind of whether the trend of enforcement events, again, reported in the media, so with some of the biases that some of you have asked about, and then the trend in those articles also mentioning using chilling language. Okay, here I'm showing four business-related chilling: reduce commerce, workers staying home, reduce foot traffic, and business closure. And what you can see is that the top panel shows 2024, right? Has a different y-axis, much smaller numbers, but you see that really during 2024, while there is some mention of chilling language, enforcement events don't really mention chilling language alongside. And then you see an explosion of chilling language that corresponds with what ICE is doing starting in 2025. Okay. In fact, this spike that you see in December of 2024 here is actually not even from a 24 event. It's an NPR story that was syndicated reporting a 2019 raid and the economic fallout from that raid, trying to anticipate what might happen after Trump's inauguration. Okay. And another way to show this is as follows. The correlation, this is just correlational, not causal. Okay. The correlation between ICE enforcement events and reporting of chilling language more than doubles after 2025. Okay, so there seems to be a qualitative difference in how the community is perceiving what ICE is doing and how they're responding economically. And to get this, to give some flavor to this, I have a few quotes that I think are worth mentioning. I'm going to skip this slide. It's not that important. I'm not going to read all these quotes, but just to give you a flavor again of kind of the real human face behind these cold statistics. So in terms of reduced commercial activity, I'll just pick the second one here. I would say our delivery has gone down by about 60% from about 2 days after you started to see people getting picked up, right? This is a restaurant owner in Washington, D.C. Another thing, and this was really surprising. This is very consistent. Is that the most common analogy that people are using to describe what happened is COVID. There's literally thousands and thousands of references to people saying this is worse than COVID. This reminds me of COVID, right? I can survive COVID, but I don't know if I can survive this. Right? I think that first quote there from California, right? It's worse than COVID. People aren't just broke, they're scared. They're not even trying to come out anymore. Worse than COVID. That's a very common way that people are describing what's going on. Workers staying home. Also very common things that you read. This first one, right? 200 construction workers failed to report to multiple large commercial sites in Raleigh. This is Raleigh, North Carolina, which is not one of the areas that was primarily targeted. Charlotte was more targeted, but even in Raleigh, you see kind of this fear by workers. And then you even see other patterns that showed up quantitatively in the qualitative data. This first one to me is a very powerful quote. This is from Charlotte. Weeks later, the sidewalks of Central Avenue are still uncharacteristically quiet. It's like a hurricane came through, and then we have to deal with the aftermath, which is much longer than the event itself. Okay. This is very consistent with this like earthquake, right? That has these long-term effects. Well, long-term, right? Effects that last weeks and months. I'm not talking years here because I don't have the data to prove that. And also you see a little bit of the temporal decay, and this is a little less common, but several stories that talk about business moving away from where it was originally done. So vendors moving to suburbs or commerce shifting to the edges of neighborhoods to kind of avoid any kind of enforcement activity. And so I think when you put these two things together, you realize that these quantitative patterns show up and affect people in very real ways that are tangible. And that there does seem to be something different about this, right? This is not just, right, to use the common term, it's not just your grandpa's immigration enforcement. There's something new and unique about it. So I'll finish with this. Um, Immigration enforcement has a real and legitimate role, right? In any immigration system, you need to enforce certain laws. And I think there are very valid policy debates about what that role should be. I think, though, that what this evidence suggests is that whatever this is, it's not it. Okay. Immigration enforcement should not be harming the economy in this kind of way. And so my hope, at least, is that these results help put the conversation a little bit more in a rational perspective and help us think of what is the real role of enforcement and what should it not be. And I think I'm convinced that it should not be what I just showed you. All right, so let me finish with this. First, my appreciation for the excellent questions and comments. We still have a few more minutes for questions that I'm happy to take. And if I could be shamelessly self-serving, um, the paperback edition of my book is coming out in June. That's the one with the red cover that you see. If anything today was useful, I encourage you to consider getting a copy or telling your friends about it. Um, that's as much self-promotion as I want to do. Let me finish by thanking again you, all of you, and the organizers for having me here, and I'll be happy to take questions for what remains.
Great. Thanks so much for a fascinating talk, Zeke. We have a couple of questions left, so I maybe just ask these and then we can conclude. So one is about the role of informal networks and informal sort of community aid that might come along to help these businesses, and whether that is something that you could see with your data and maybe quantify as well.
Actually, yes. So I'm glad someone asked that. I was on the fence on whether to include that or not, but it seemed a little off topic, but clearly it wasn't. Anyway, um, besides fear and hiding, the second most common category of qualitative evidence that I got from these news articles was actually community support, right? And so the other thing you're seeing is that communities are really rising up to help. And that's everything from monitoring where ICE agents are to buying groceries for families that are afraid to go out. And so I guess part of the economic adjustment is that uh, who is spending and showing up at a store might not be the ultimate target of the goods being purchased. That's showing up a lot in the qualitative evidence. Thanks for asking that.
And there's another question about whether you see anything on the financing of these businesses as well, like whether you see an impact there, um, and also on potentially remittances that these immigrant businesses are sending.
Yeah, good question. So I would love to do that. If anyone has suggestions on where I can get the data, I would love to add that because I think that is a very important aspect of the economic ramifications. I don't have the data to do that. Um, I suppose one could look at remittances. I think you could get the data, but these would be individuals. I think so. I think. So for remittances, I think I might know where to get the data. I don't know for investment in these businesses. The other thing that I've been
Maybe
thinking of
business
doing,
closures is something that's observed and registered somewhere, but
yeah, business closure I see in the qualitative evidence, but I would need another source for and to see if like I can get either business hours or businesses just kind of disappearing. Um, I suppose maybe from Advent I can see if a retailer disappeared. I haven't looked into that. I think another question related to that would be entrepreneurship. Are new businesses being started, or is there a long-term effect on where businesses are being started? I think that might take a little bit longer to observe than the time scale I have, but I think those are all excellent, excellent things to look at. And if anyone has ideas on how I can test them, I welcome that.
great. I think this captures all of the main questions we had here. Any additional questions we got, we'll just send them to you offline, so you have those. But this has been really a fascinating talk, and we're pretty excited to have you. And so thanks a lot for doing this, and everybody for listening. So we'll see you again for the next time. So thanks a lot, Zeke. Yeah.
Thanks so much, everyone. What was wonderful.
Bye
Have a
bye.
good day.